are listening to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda. In this episode, we're talking about A People's History of the World, track number 12 on 1996's Less Talk, More Rock.
Keith, did you know that this was originally not going to be track 12 on Less Talk, More Rock?
I didn't know that, no.
So something cool I noticed is that whenever I was scoping out Chris's Patreon the other day, he posted a picture of a cassette tape with the original track listing, and A People's History doesn't appear on the track listing. This song's working title was Turning Point after the opening line in the song. It's some turning point in history. So in the initial sequencing of this record that Chris talked about elsewhere, it also was track 9 in an original track listing and would have been following Preteen McCarthyist in the original track sequencing. But then when the album got resequenced in its current form in another version of the cassette tape that Chris posted in a later sequencing version, it was still listed as Turning Point on another cassette. So I have no idea when or how this song got retitled, and I would be curious to hear about that little alteration on Chris's podcast someday if he ever gets around to doing this song. So that was kind of a cool little tidbit that it was called Turning Point, and it was originally going to be track 9, and it was originally going to follow Preteen McCarthyist. And here's another thing that I kept thinking about. I actually think this song would have been a perfect opener to the record. And yeah. I think if this exact record was made today, because let's face it, this album could come out tomorrow and it would sound just as good today as it did in 1996 because the lyrics are so relevant. But I feel like People's History would be sequenced by a record label as being the lead track if it came out now. Or maybe not. But if I were working at a record label, I think that I would have at least suggested this one be the opening track because of that quiet opening guitar riff going into that speedy tune where the vocals kick in right away. So that was a few of my observations as I was thinking about this song for the last couple of days.
It would have had one of those deceptive feelings where you think, wait, is this the actual guitar tone? And is this what it's going to sound like? And of course, then it kicks in. But I could totally see that too, because I think Let's Talk, the B-side, has more fully developed and it seems like longer songs. So putting this on the A side and starting off the record with it, I think totally makes sense. And to address People's History of the World. So obviously this book takes its name, at least partially, from the famous Howard Zinn work, A People's History of the United States. For anyone who might be unaware, Howard Zinn was a historian. He was an author, a professor, playwright, and an activist. His life's work focused on a wide range of issues, including race, class, war, and history. He grew up in Brooklyn in a working-class immigrant household, and at 13, he became a shipyard worker. He later went on to read about fascism in Europe and engaged in political discussions and debates with some young communists in his neighborhood, and they invited him to a political rally at Times Square. And he talks about how this is a turning point in his life. And he said, from that moment on, I was no longer a liberal, a believer in the self-correcting character of American democracy. The situation required not just a new president or new laws, but an uprooting of the old order, the introduction of a new kind of society, cooperative, peaceful, egalitarian. So he joined the Air Force and he flew bombing missions during World War II. And this, of course, helps shape his view and his opposition to war throughout his lifetime. And he went on to say also that I would not deny that World War II had a certain moral core, but that made it easier for Americans to treat all subsequent wars with a kind of glow, Zinn said. Every enemy becomes Hitler.
Ooh, that's dark.
And after attending college under the GI Bill, he worked as a warehouse loader while earning a PhD in history from Columbia. From 1956 to 1963, he taught at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, where he became active in the civil rights movement. Spelman College is a historically Black university, and it's a women's university, I believe. And after being fired from Spelman for his support of student protesters, Zinn became a professor of political science at Boston University, where he taught until his retirement in 1988. And though his name, of course, pops up pretty frequently, and we'll address in today's episode how Zinn is being talked about today, in 2010, the FBI released a 423-page file on Howard Zinn, the radical historian. So according to the FBI, they began to investigate Zinn in 1945, noting his involvement with left-wing political groups after his service in the military. And for one example, in 1953, 2 agents approached Zinn in New York City, and according to their report, he was advised that the Bureau had received information concerning his associations with the Communist Party and was affording him this opportunity to discuss it with the agents of the FBI.
Oh my gosh. And that's really funny too, because so he retires in 88. And so by the time, he starts getting popular within the punk scene, he had already been retired for years and years. And he was just this old man kicking it in Boston. I love it. I love it. Zinn's famous book is People's History of the United States. And seeing as how propaganda are Canadian, reframing the song title as A People's History of the World is a way to me of saying that the limited in scope education found within American classrooms is prevalent elsewhere also. So even though American students get a very certain strain of messages and teachings within their classrooms historically in the US, though I think that some interesting work is being done now to reframe the history of our country in American classrooms or in US classrooms, these limitations are elsewhere also. Having been a teacher myself in Mexico, England, and the US, the problem of telling the narrative of history from the point of view of the conqueror isn't just an American phenomenon. So this happens all over the place.
People's History of the United States tells the U.S.'s story from the point of view of women, factory workers, African Americans, Native Americans, the working poor, immigrant laborers, and the book highlights the fights for fair wages, for the 8-hour workday, for child labor laws, health and safety standards, universal suffrage, women's rights, racial equality, and talks about the grassroots organizations that fought for a fairer life and the resistance faced in each of those issues. And the book covers everything from Columbus's arrival up into President Clinton's first term.
I don't know about you. I will never forget the first time I read that opening chapter on Columbus's arrival and the story of the Arawaks that were living where Columbus landed. I mean, it has stuck with me forever. Like, do you have a story about finding this book for the first time?
It was my freshman year at IUN. One of the professors I had for basically just a 100 level U.S. history course the first semester. I think all of my experiences teaching now, in a way, have eclipsed what I first felt, though it was a gut punch. And it was that feeling of, wait a second, this is completely different from what I've learned previously. And why have I not learned that until now? But also the self-doubt, like, why am I reading this? And who else doesn't have the chance to read this because I'm reading it in a college classroom and not in, a high school classroom? There was like this just self-doubt there, thinking then I had to share this with other people who might not have heard of it or might not have access to it.
And I'll never forget that as well, because getting those stories told from differing perspectives is one of the most amazing learning experiences I've ever had. And it sent me down sort of a spiral where I felt like I had been lied to forever, essentially. But anyway, this book spawned a movement of other books too. And I'm not entirely sure how much Zinn's book inspired these other ones that I'm about to talk about. But the title similarities show that there must be some kind of influence in these other titles. So first of all, there's Chris Harmon's book, People's History of the World. There is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's An Indigenous People's History of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I use that in my classroom.
Awesome. There is Rebecca Steffoff's adaptation for young people, which I love, called A Young People's History of the United States, which I read just for personal enjoyment because I have such intense attention problems with long books that I have actually taken to reading Rebecca Steffoff's adaptation for like 8th graders.
Yeah, my students look forward to it when they see it laid out on the desks. They're like,
sweet.
"Oh, we're reading that today."
Nice. Do you have like a class set of them laying around?
Yeah, I use school money for it.
Awesome. So there is also Mike Konopacki and Paul Buell's A People's History of American Empire, which is a graphic novel adaptation of the work of Zinn, which it's such a great book. I got it at the National Council for the Social Studies National Conference, I believe, in like 2013 when I was presenting there, and I found it in the presentation hall. So I took that home with me, and it still is on my shelf today. And then there's also the incredible collection that came out, I think it was in like 2004, 2005, called Voices of a People's History, which is a storytelling series. And there are audio recordings for it as well. Like it was a series of events that they did that they compiled into a book. But Voices of a People's History is truly incredible. And there are probably some others that I haven't listed as well. But I mean, you can't deny like the similarity in titles and then some of the power of those adaptations. I mean, it's really cool when you think about it, you know?
I would also share the counter, how clearly A People's History inspired A Patriot's History of the United States, from Columbus's great discovery to the War on Terror.
Interesting. Yeah, I've seen that book. I have yet to pick it up. And for a lot of folks out there, I bet Propagandy was in fact the doorway to reading and learning about history in such a way, in the way that Zinn presents it. And, I found a 20-year anniversary article of Less Talk, More Rock on Vice's website by Ron Knox. And a passage jumped out at me where Knox writes, "For a new generation of punk kids in 1996, no other band exposed young listeners to the educational possibilities of punk like Propagandy. It was the first band to provide them with those primary sources of information to impart actual physical literature by people like Zinn, Chomsky, and others that they may have never come across otherwise." And I couldn't agree more. I've got a list of titles in my head that I tie squarely back to like reading about it in Propagandy liner notes. Like those early Rise Against records had a couple book listings as well. This song, A People's History of the World, directly challenges us to learn because it says your teachers aren't going to give you the full story. So here are some methods that you can use in order to get that full story. Oh, and I think another book was Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Lowe, and that was another big one for me as well.
Yeah.
But I have a feeling the band may like this song quite a lot still, because I found, several videos of them playing it live, but also because it's one of 2 MP3s available on the Propagandy website on the Let's Talk LP section that you can actually just stream right off the website. And, there's a bunch of songs on the record. They could have picked any song for somebody to hit play on the website. And this is one of the 2 available on propagandy.com/music that you can just go and listen to off the website.
Well, I like that. I like to think that they still look back and enjoy this one. So, Greg, let's get to our guest segments. We have 2 today.
Oh, Keith, tell me about our first guest and tell me what you talked about.
So our first guest is Dr. Heather Mayer, whom I found on Twitter because she was tweeting about Propagandy to Grim Kim Kelly. And I instantly just responded and like kind of nudged my way into that conversation and said, would you like to talk about Propagandy? So Dr. Mayer is a historian interested in social justice movements in the United States, introduced to the history of radicalism through punk music and the anti-globalization and anti-war activism of the late 1990s and the early 2000s. She decided to focus her studies on the intersections of gender and labor activism and she received her PhD from Simon Fraser University. So please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Heather Mayer. Dr. Heather Mayer, welcome to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Mayer, can you tell us a bit about your musical journey, like what got you into punk and any other music that's sort of off the beaten path?
Well, for me, it was in the kind of early high school days, and usually from, people having older siblings who introduced me to that music, a little bit of when, Offspring, Green Day, Rancid starting to get more radio popularity. And there were a lot of punk bands in my high school. And so there were a lot of local kind of high school shows that we were going to in the mid 90s. Yeah. So once it started from there and I kind of discovered the scene of growing up in Portland, Oregon, then it just came to like researching every band that was coming to town and like, oh, there's going to be a show. Never heard of that band. Better go, look them up. And so that led me to, a lot of bands on like Epitaph and Fat Records and, the Fat Records comps. And I think I first heard Propaganda on the Survival of the Fattest comp, I believe. And that was my introduction there. And the Less Talk More Rock album was, I think, the first one. And then I listened to How to Clean Everything after that.
So who are some of the other local bands that maybe I won't know, but some of our listeners might?
Oh, for high school days, you would have to probably have grown up in Portland, but it was like Berserk and National Guard were the ones kind of from my high school, and going to places like, La Luna was a big venue there, Stage 4, and it just felt like there were shows all the time. Mm-hmm. And so there was always an opportunity to do that and go hang out with some friends. And a lot of them were all ages shows, which was awesome because I was, in high school then. And so that was where I met, a lot of the friends I still have today, was just through that scene and listening to music together.
Yeah, I think that's something that maybe people outside of punk and metal and other types of less mainstream music aren't aware of, like how the social part can be pretty integral in the involvement, where it's not just like getting a ticket and then going up to Chicago for me to see a band and that's it, but how habitual and how it kind of shaped. I mean, it still does now, not during the pandemic, but I mean, geez, my 20s and early 30s are just constantly road warrior between different, and if it was a band I like and they're, within a 3-hour drive, you go to see it.
Right. That was the entire social life. And that's where you saw your friends, especially when you're younger. You don't have bars to go hang out at, You're going to see your friends at the show, and there's probably going to be one show a week or every 2 weeks coming to town. And that was the social life.
So I came across you on Twitter by chance, specifically an interview with Oregon State University Press, and you cite punk as your introduction to like radical history. Can you share a bit about that process and then a little bit about your research interests as a historian?
Yeah. So I started off, being interested in punk music. And like I said, the social aspect of it and the kind of, anti-authoritarian energy. But as I kept going, in high school and I was becoming more interested in history myself, seeing those bands that really started connecting the anger to some specifics, not just I'm anti everything, but like, here are some things you should actually be really mad about.
Yeah.
And connecting those things to resources. I think that's how I got to know about AK Press, was through Propaganda. And then I started, reading everything coming out of AK Press, a lot of anarchist history.
Mm-hmm.
And this coincided with events that were going on in the world. So I started college in the fall of 1999 at the University of Oregon. And that was when the WTO protests in Seattle happened. And so, we're a few hours away from Seattle. There were a lot of students from my college who had gone up there and students in my classes who were coming back and talking about their experiences with those protests. And then by the time I graduated in 2003, we were involved in going to protests against the war in Iraq, and the war in Iraq was just beginning. And so my college experiences were kind of bookended by these events that were going on.
Yeah.
And I think an increased understanding of anarchism and anarchist history and labor activism and labor history, that I started, kind of connecting what was going on in the present for me to what I was interested in learning about in the past. So specifically around like anti-war activism, as we were doing things like that in the early 2000s, it's like, what did this look like a century ago? What did this look like around World War I?
Yeah.
And so I was connecting those events with the things that I wanted to study in history. And part of that was also around women's rights, women's activism, reproductive justice, all of that. And so that kind of led me in all of these steps to being interested in learning about the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, because I saw that there was this line in a history book that said, it was talking about Portland, my hometown, as a hotbed of birth control agitation and an IWW stronghold. And I was like, yes, I want to study that.
Yeah.
And so that led me into my research and writing a book about how women interacted with and were members of the union in the Pacific Northwest in the early 20th century. So that involved, not only labor activism, but anti-war agitation, birth control agitation, supporting sex workers as workers, all of these different range of women's issues, and looking about how they connected to the work of the IWW and as members of the IWW in, the region that I was from. So it was kind of just all of these steps of things that just got me more and more invested and interested, to the point where I could see where the holes in the story were, historically, the stories that still needed to be told. And that's what led me into my research.
That's so interesting, because I think a lot of the music that I first thought, hey, this is my music, was definitely that kind of angsty, maybe like angry to be angry, but not really informed angry.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I think, the average person may not be able to draw those lines between something like punk and hardcore to these bigger questions about our history, where we fit in, and how those things have like either evolved over the time or they echo, the same issues from 80 or 90 years ago.
Right. And I think we see this now for a lot of people. I'm thinking back at that period, 20 years ago, when, my God, we thought the Bush years were bad. And then, thinking about how, listening back to some of those songs I was listening to then, and how, relevant they very much are to our current circumstances. They were from a specific time and place, but some of these issues have transcended.
Can you share a little bit more about that? Like, that's something that Greg has also commented on, somewhat saying that Bush is receiving like this national makeover right now. How do you see that, as someone into punk and as a historian, this sort of rewriting of a legacy while that person is still alive? I mean, is this more of the same? Does that always happen? Is that a product of really insane circumstances right now that the country's going through? What do you think about that?
It's hard to tell, because this is the one that I've lived through, so I'm thinking of my memories and my experiences so much. But I was reading, there's a book called Fault Lines about the 1970s, and some of the stuff that I didn't know about happening in the 70s, that I was like, oh, that's happening again. And things that, there does seem to be quite a bit of repetition. And yeah, the way, that Bush is looked at as like, he's just this friendly painter guy now,
right.
That,
yeah.
And yes, maybe comparatively so, but, it's definitely, I think the Obama years, well, obviously there were still a lot of challenges and a lot of things going on there. It gave everyone this like little bit of a reprieve from this kind of constant, like, what is happening here, that we've all been forced back into times a million in the last 4 years. That, it does seem comforting to think back to 20 years ago, but also because we know we made it past that, and things kind of seem to get better after that. And so I think it's easier to look back and be like, well, maybe it wasn't so bad, because then we got this stuff later, that
Right.
like, I remember the 2004 election, not only Bush being reelected, but particularly the, like anti-gay marriage laws that were being passed around the country, and I think, again, we look back later and say, well, but then it became legal a few years after that. And so it doesn't seem as terrible because
Sure.
we know how things went. But then, I mean, things seemed pretty terrible in,
Yeah.
2003, 2004.
Yeah. I can't help but think the people I know who would have egged on, the guy who threw a shoe at Bush
Mhm.
are also now sharing those like photo ops of Bush with like celebrities. Like, oh, look, it's like, no, it's like a Mobius strip of just bad marketing, publicity, and like collective amnesia.
Right.
So you mentioned a little bit about how you first
Mhm.
heard propaganda from one of the comps, which is cool because so many of the guests like have a similar story.
Mhm.
Do you like remember any first thoughts, like reactions? Was it later on when you first heard like the full length Less Talk that something really clicked? Like, tell us a little bit more about first hearing the band.
I think it really clicked in seeing just kind of how many different issues they spoke to, and just the way like the Less Talk More Rock album was so, I mean, it was so in your face in so many ways. And I think and those weren't necessarily things that my friends and I were talking about. I wouldn't
Yeah.
say that, the other people that also listened to the band that I went to shows with most were not politically engaged. And so I felt like it kind of gave me something I was seeking a little bit that I didn't have, even though the people I knew loved the music, I didn't have as many friends in the scene that were also really interested in being more kind of political about it or digging more into that history. So it kind of made me feel like, there are people in this scene that are into this, like it might not be the interest of all the people that I'm hanging out with as much. But there are people out there that are, and Propaganda was actually one of the bands that I didn't see during this time period where I was going to shows all the time. I didn't see them until probably, I think it was maybe 2008 or so. Like I don't really go to shows anymore, but I'll
Right.
go to this one because I've never seen them face. So I didn't even get to like go to one of their shows during this time period. So I think I just felt like it connected me, I think, to something bigger that I was reaching for that I didn't quite know was there yet in high school.
Yeah, it seems like this entry point for so many fans toward these issues that are still not like, oh, there's the issue, and then like I've moved on beyond it, but still trying to absorb these ideas from albums that came out, like 20 years ago.
Right.
That's what I find to be super unique and special about this band is that not only the like you said, the number of topics and issues that are addressed, but how they're done in a way that I still think remain relevant and fresh and still instill like a curiosity in me to continue to find out more about those things you're talking about.
Right. When I was, looking back at the Less Talk More Rock, lyrics and looking at, the only good fascist is a very dead fascist. I'm like, we could, be writing and singing that song today for
Yeah.
sure. And I think, again, when I was growing up, as a white woman in predominantly white community, I wasn't thinking about how my whiteness shaped my world and my understanding of it at that point. But yet, these lyrics are, talking about this kind of, white history and is that what you're so proud of and all of these things that, again, I was still just starting to really think about and understand at that point.
Yeah, I think the conversations that I hope to have, if and when I eventually have children, are like kind of the conversations that I first heard from punk bands. Like I didn't have these talks, or I didn't have this sort of like, just open dialogue with my parents about these things, which no fault to theirs. I just in their own kind of bubble, in their own world, and the things that were their struggles, they probably didn't put on a larger scale. But as a as a history teacher, as as someone who tries to be aware and involved as much as possible, like I hope my future kids get to hear this from Punk Bandits too, but I hope they don't just hear it from punk bands, but also teachers and also me and other friends.
Right. I mean, it's a thing. So I have two children, and my children are multiracial. My husband is Nigerian. And so like they're 2 and 5. So we're just starting those conversations,
Yeah.
that literally go towards more like the actual color of people's skin and talking about that. But like, so I know it's going to be present in our lives in a way that it never was in mine growing up. But I also think of it as, as a teacher and somebody who has taught history. So this is my first term not teaching history in 12 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is a big transition for me. But, for so long, I taught U.S. history, pre-colonial to present at the community college level, which I love. But so much of it, I feel like I centered students like myself as I was teaching, and particularly my early teaching. I kept thinking about like my white students need to understand the history of whiteness and white supremacy in this country. Which is important, but also when I center that, then I'm not necessarily thinking about the needs and experiences of the students of color in my classes. And like, that's been, again, as we teach things and understand things, it's, it's something that we have to be constantly aware of and thinking about, like, how do we do this in a way that benefits everyone in our classroom and gets them where they're at and what they need. And I'm sure as a teacher, like it's a challenge. Like there's no exact right answer for how to do that.
Yeah, I'm afraid with everything happening that we're going to pay for some program, right? And we're going to have like 3 or 4 months of some sort of like canned diversity training without really meaningfully addressing and acknowledging and questioning like the systems of inequality that shape pretty much every measurable part of life. And that's something that I really hope like that I try to convey with my students, that like the ideas of equality and justice are they're aspirational. Right? These are things that we hope for, but if we really like look at data and look at like people's lives, right, we're not living up to that. And it has to be better than like a 25-minute video that all teachers are going to be required to watch, and that's the end of the conversation.
Right. And I think that's what, when we get to the college level of teaching students too, I hear so frequently from students like, well, yeah, I hated history in high school, and like the gym coach was my history teacher and all of that kind of thing, So it is, and when I've taught, it's always been a quarter system. So you got 10 weeks with students to get that many of them from like, history was boring, names and dates, not relevant to me, to like, I need to understand everything that happened to understand, who I am as a person in this country. Like history has shaped all of that, all of the choices, all of, the reasons why, the people in your classroom are all there in that classroom together has been shaped by forces of history. And so to get people to kind of understand that from right off the bat, when you have a short amount of time to work with them, without making a history class be just this like litany of depressing, terrible things, because it can become that too.
Oh, for sure. Oh, I just got an angry email or a phone call from a parent about the content that I'm covering in week 2, and she said I didn't cover that. I didn't learn about that till high school. And I said, yeah, me neither. That's why I'm doing it now, because I'm not guaranteed that they'll actually learn about it in high school.
Right.
So let's talk about the song "A People's History of the World." Why does this song stand out to you?
This song stands out to me because I have a very like specific memory of it. I was taking a French class in high school, and we had an assignment, which thinking back was a super awesome assignment, where we had to find a protest song and translate it into French. And this was the song that I chose. So I think it was my junior year. So, probably about 17, and I brought in, I think I still had the cassette at that point, and I brought it in and showed it to my teacher. And I was like, this is the song I'm doing. And he took it and he just wanted to read all of the lyrics. And he took the cover from me and just started reading. He's like, where did you find this? And in a way that was just not like mad, but just like, this is like, how are you like here in this like suburban, white high school? Like, where did you find this?
What a great response.
Yeah, and it was great. And he let me use the slang dictionary that he kept behind his desk, because I think fuckface is in the first line of the song. And that was not in our regular French dictionaries. So he let me use the slang dictionary for that. And then we all had to, at the end, play the song and then read our translation out loud. So my entire French class got to hear this song, and they were just all kind of like, this is weird, Yeah. So that, like, I have like this, I studied those lyrics for so long that song always stands out to me more than anything. But also, again, just like amazing that I had that opportunity to think in depth about it and to introduce it to other people. And then how it, like at that point, seeing A People's History of the World, I had no reference for Howard Zinn, A People's History of the U.S., which I would go on to read later in college, and all of these things, we talk about when you think about how people learn, setting the stage and giving them things to connect things to. So later on, I can connect when I'm reading history, like, oh, that was that reference in this song. Or I think about with the Good Riddance album, Operation Phoenix, when I went to college and I saw, I think it was the Berkeley in the 60s documentary, and I saw the Mario Savio speech. And I'm like, I know this speech. I know every word of this speech.
Right.
Like, because it was on this album I listened to all the time. And being able to like connect all of those things together and give myself a framework to learn about them and to understand them. I just like, I think it's so cool when I look back on it, that all of these things connected in that way.
That kind of reminds me, like, buying a copy of like Soledad Brother, to me for the longest time was, oh, this is one of the books in Rage Against the Machine's Evil Empire's like liner notes. Like, to me, like, that's the connection. It's with that band, and then over time those references, those works, those books, whatever, kind of just blow up and like kind of expand your worldview. I'm curious, as you were translating it, do you think that helped you think about or understand the ideas more? Because so like I think I didn't start really learning a second language until my 20s. I speak some okay Russian, and it's dwindling every day. But that I noticed helped me really understand the ins and outs of like English grammar so much more. So do you think like there was anything in that process that kind of forced you to like close read it and really unlock something bigger?
Yeah, because I remember one of the words being, in the lines, because if the rabble heard the truth, and I was like, what's the rabble? Like, I don't know what that means, and then like, so looking that up to then translate it, and then to think about like, what does that mean as even a concept?
Yeah.
And like what they're talking about here, it definitely, I think, afforded me that opportunity to look at it more closely and think about, those choices in words. Because when you're translating, you're thinking, it's not literal, you have to think about meaning and if the meaning is actually being portrayed. And so it gave me so much more of an opportunity to think about why lyrics were chosen and why words were chosen in that particular song.
Do you remember anyone else's songs that they translated in
I don't. I think a lot of them were kind of like, 60s rock protest songs, which, nothing wrong with that. It was fun. It was what people knew,
I'm guessing, I'm imagining like, Pete Seeger and then randomly Propagandy in the middle of some folk song. So what else, what are some other thoughts that you have about this song? Like as a punk, as a historian, any particular lines that resonate or stand out with you, or that like, hit you when you first heard the album, but also, kind of connect with now?
I mean, I think it is, and that knowledge is power idea, which is, overplayed in some ways, I suppose. But this idea that like, I need to learn more, and I'm going to have to learn it on my own. Like nobody's going to tell me this stuff. I've got to find it, and I've got to figure it out. And that's what kind of kept coming to me. I had planned through college to be a high school teacher. That was my goal. And I actually focused on like ancient Greek and Roman history when I was in college at first. And then my senior year, one of my professors said, have you ever thought about going to grad school in history? And I hadn't, because no one I had known had ever gone to grad school, and I didn't even really know what that meant. I knew like what a teaching license was and a teaching degree, but like I didn't know just general grad school. And I started thinking about it, and I was like, I don't think I can teach the way I want to teach in a high school. Like, I think I'm going to have to teach college if I want to teach the stuff I want to teach about.
Right.
And so that's what kind of, in that moment I was like, maybe I can still teach, but I can do it at this other level, and then I can really get into this stuff, So I think, it's part of this idea that, it's not going, this kind of knowledge isn't necessarily going to be handed to you, because it can be powerful and it can be life-changing, I think, to understand things. And I think we're seeing that right now, on a large scale reckoning of people having, the bubble burst for them in a way that this maybe was a minority of, at least for, I think, white people in the 90s. There wasn't a whole lot who were investigating like what white supremacy looked like and how it showed up in their own lives and the privilege they had.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think this was like, it was a taste of a little bit of that we're seeing on a much larger scale right now.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I think if I would have first heard this band in 8th grade, right, I probably would have just spurted out some homophobic slur and gone back to listening to new metal, and like that would have been it, and you and I would not be having this conversation. Right. And I would be probably teaching my history class pretty differently. So I think where I was at my point, like in my life, definitely the kind of the lock and the key just fit. And if it was much earlier, I wasn't ready. I wouldn't have been ready then. And I still question how much I'm even ready for a lot of these things now.
Right.
So I'm curious, since you said like the first year in 12 years, not teaching. For me as a middle school teacher, I'm curious about your experiences with like the unlearning that takes place at the higher education and at the college level. So I'd like to think that, I support public education, but I see what other teachers do and don't do. And it's really hard for me to make blanket statements like saying like all teachers or all whomever, because I see, the myths and misrepresentations that are just perpetuated. But for me, even bigger, because that can kind of be like you read a book or you watch a documentary or whatever, but the culture, I think, of just complacency and obedience and compliance, I think that is like the real one of the like elephants in the room in terms of public education. So working in higher ed, what have been some of your obstacles in addressing those things that students are bringing, from 12 years of public education?
Yeah. Oh, it's hard. I mean, I think because there is so much of that complacency in the higher ed levels. And I mean, the history department can sometimes be the most conservative department, or at least probably about a half and half. It's that there's probably some people interested in radical history, and there's definitely some that aren't, and they usually have a little more say. So I've seen that at like the curriculum level, those kind of battles of like, should we even be teaching Western Civ? Why aren't we teaching a world history survey instead? But at the level of teaching, and I have taught mostly online for the last several years, particularly after having kids. And so I have worked on developing ways of, in a very short time, trying to understand and get to know my students and get to know where they're coming from. And that can help me to work with them where they're at a little bit more, because especially in a community college classroom, I have people who this is their, fourth try at taking some college classes. And then I have people who already have bachelor's in other areas, but want to go back to become high school teachers. And so they need a U.S. history class. And so I have these classrooms with broad ranges of experience and understanding. And I think some of the challenge is figuring out how to get them to work together in some ways where it's not just like, hey, the know-it-all is over here, we're going to correct everyone else. and to help bring in, their lives and their experiences into what we're studying and what we're learning. Because I think the point that I want them to understand more than anything is how history impacts who you are and where you are and what you do today, and that people not much different than yourself have done things in history that have made change.
Yeah.
Like, those are the things that I want them to understand. And it's always disappointing how apolitical college students are, and not all of them, but there always are, several coming in just being like, I don't really know or care what's happening in the world.
Mhm.
And so that's a challenge to get people to care. But I've worked on doing like assignments in the first week of class where I have people write their history autobiography. So I say, tell me
Mhm.
about how you learned the story of the United States. Was what you learned in school
Oh, wow.
similar to what you learned from your community and your family? If you didn't grow up here, what did you learn about the United States? And has it been different since you came here? And so it's the very first thing that they do. And I really get to understand where they're coming from on a much deeper level. And I get them from the beginning to think about what is the story that they learned about the United States? And for some people, it is like, I learned this in school, but then my community lived an entirely different story, and that's what I learned.
Yeah.
Or I have a lot of students who are veterans, and they have really complicated feelings about what they learned before, maybe they went into the Army or whatever. And so getting them to really just dive in and start to unpack those from the very beginning helps me as a teacher to get to know them, and it helps them to understand how these stories shape us and our views, and how they can be conflicting or complicated. There's not just, and many of them start with, well, I learned, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and
Right.
that's all they really know. And so that gives me a place to go from there. And hopefully that helps them to think, oh, all I really remember is like this rhyme about Columbus, from my entire education. So that's part of, just the challenges of meeting students where they are and making it relevant to them.
I think that self-awareness and kind of overused, but meta. I mean, how meta history can be in thinking like, well, if we're reading just our textbook in class, but what made the cut and what didn't. And
Mm-hmm.
I think for my students, it's kind of the first time for a lot of them that they've really like asked those questions, and then they've like kind of tried to investigate a little bit, like not just why, but then so what the purpose would be, and then what's the outcome of only hearing this version.
Right. And I think, particularly, hence the email you got from a parent,
Yeah.
the way that, mostly for like white American children, this idea that like, we want to keep their innocence for so long before we tell them about the bad stuff,
Yeah.
in a way that, children who are the descendants of enslaved people don't get to wait until, they're 14 or somebody decided that it's time for them to learn the hard truths,
Yeah.
like that learning comes much easier. And those parents don't have, the same choices. And so I think that that's part of this idea too of, what age things are appropriate and how you do things appropriately, to help. Like, my son's starting to ask me questions, and he's 5, and I can't quite explain to him like the entire system of, slavery and how it worked yet, but like we can
Right.
talk about how, some people are treated differently and how it's not fair, and how like those types of things that are definitely, like we talked about earlier, not conversations that I had growing up at all.
Yeah, I ask my students like every year after we read about European conquest and like an adapted version of Zinn's A People's History. Can you teach this in elementary school? And they're always like, no, it's too graphic and it's too much. And I always counter by saying, didn't you learn about slavery in elementary school? And they're like, well, yeah. And there's that disconnect that I
Mm-hmm.
think is at least in part racial. I don't know if that's the only explanation, but how we've kind of like accepted the mass brutality and the systems of violence against Americans descended from Africans or brought over at that time. but we kind of don't afford that either empathy or honesty or reflection with like many other groups. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's something that every year I'm surprised by that students say that I get, like, leaving out really graphic details, but still addressing, like, you could still say, enslaved person, whether that is, an Arawak or someone from the western coast of Africa.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'm amazed, again, as a person who's got a PhD in 20th century U.S. history. I read David Truer's The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee recently, and which is about kind of Native American history post 1890. And I was like, I still haven't learned. Again, I'm almost 40 years old. I have a PhD in history. I teach history. And I didn't know most of these things, mostly because I hadn't looked.
Right.
And it hadn't been part of what had been deemed the kind of the essentials by, in the studies that I had and the classes that I had took. And so that, there's so much that we don't know, and reframing some of those things for our students is really important.
So what do you think people get most wrong about history?
I mean, it feels there's so much, and it's so, I mean, I think what they in general get wrong is just this idea that, like, it's not important or not relevant. And then, I think when you think about, like, actual myths and understandings, particularly around, the Civil War and around the Founding Fathers, and just, I was listening to Joanne Freeman do a podcast. She's a historian who studies Alexander Hamilton, and she talked about, like, I spent so many years trying to convince people that Hamilton was somebody they should know about, and now I have to convince them, like, he wasn't actually that important, as you make him out to be. So I think we're always trying to contend with, I have students now who are Hamilton obsessed, and that's all they know about Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
Which I'm like, that's weird to be your entry point, but, like, so there's all these kinds of things, and how we talk, and I have my students do discussions about, learning about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and, like, what does this mean? Like, how does it change how you view Jefferson? And to think through all of those things, because it's not, it's not a black or white kind. I mean, it is when we think about race in this country, but they're complicated things that the students need to talk through. And it's hard because when they start to learn, as we probably did too, you learn some of this stuff and then you go super extreme in the, like, anti-everything. Yeah. And then, like, in the bringing them into the nuances and everything, it's always an interesting kind of challenge in those conversations.
You are speaking my language here, because, like, 7-8 years ago, I'm like, all right, guys, now let's read some real history. Right. And like, I thought I was, like, doing them a favor by kind of introducing some subversive or, radical content, while never helping them process, like, the emotional side of it, but also not even really addressing and saying, like, well, what are the strengths and weaknesses of this text here? And and I think I never received that as a student, so I kind of just carried that on later as well. And it, like, I was, like, 19, jaded, just thinking, like, history now has, like, it has to be, like, contrary, right? It's some oppositional force.
It's got to be everything opposite of what I learned.
Yeah, exactly. Like, well, if you said this, well, it can't be, like, the historian Andrew Reeves said on Twitter, he kind of said something like, trying to make sure that the students who have, like, this America can do no wrong, American exceptionalism, once we've introduced them to, like, the awful things in history, making sure the pendulum doesn't swing to think then America is, like, this uniquely evil entity. And that took a while for me to, like, be aware of and unpack, and also to like manage with 13 and 14-year-olds.
Right. That's a whole other ballgame. And I think that we really neglect that, in the college level too, of the emotional aspect of it all, of self-reflection and of emotion as it as it happens when people learn this stuff, because, so much of what it is drilled into even at the college level is, it's about evidence and interpretation, and you leave your emotion out of it. You just
Right.
use the evidence and you interpret it. But really, again, people like, this is shaping or shattering sometimes people's sense of identity when they learn about these things.
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily have a punk scene to help them through it,
No
like
kidding.
in this whole thing, and bands to be like, all right, you got me, So how do we help care for that part of it as well, and provide them opportunities to think through things? So it's like, not just use this evidence and like, tell me what happened or how you interpret it, but like, what'd you feel doing that?
Mm-hmm.
And we don't think about that as part of teaching history or doing history.
Yeah, my experience in high school was definitely the football coach, and it was taking outline notes, and it was basically just battles. So to me, history was military history, and I never got or any on my own, or kind of explored it yet on my own, or got a version that was kind of wider than that. So let's talk a little bit more about the music. How about that?
Sorry. So we turned it into a teaching podcast.
Yeah, really. So if you haven't already, hit stop and unsubscribed on iTunes, what do you think? What do you think about the music of this song? Like, anything in terms of the composition, the performance? What stands out to you on the musical side?
I mean, it's as many songs that out, like, it's short and sweet and to the point, and you can understand what they're saying as they go through it. Like, there's songs that I love because, they're shout along choruses, and there's songs that I love, for the energy, but this is just like, it's just one that it was like, here's what it is.
Yeah.
And like, and we're done, like, this isn't a one that, like, if this came up at, during a show, this isn't the, like, grab your buddies and like get super into it kind of song, but it was the one. It was the one that spoke to the point that I needed, at that time period. And I think that's why I've got a soft spot for this one.
Yeah, I think I've noticed with some of Propagandy's music that every once in a while, it seems like the music and the writing takes a little bit of a backseat to make sure that the ideas are clear, that they're really forward, like Refusing to Be a Man, that how much it slows down, and how ineffective that song would have been if it sounded like a later Todd song, or Rio de San Atlanta, like how much of the message would be lost. And I think that also fits here with this track as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and there are definitely some times when I just, like, I want to feel the music, and I want to hear guitars, and I want to, like, be energized to a certain point, and this this isn't really that, but it's something where you can pick up on it quickly. Like, you don't have to listen to it too many times to get where they're going with this,
Yeah, it's a shower, not a grower, as they say. Well, has there been any other music that you've kind of either that's helped you manage or deal with everything that's going on in 2020? What else has been like?
It's hard. I feel like Against Me was like my 20s, for pretty much, like, every album was exactly where I was at, like all through the 2000s. And yeah, now for me, it's just been, I've been listening to a lot of different things I'm more interested in listening to music that I feel like I learn from that doesn't reflect my experiences. And so that doesn't necessarily help me. Like, I still want to listen to my same angry songs sometimes to cope, but I'm also more interested in just being like, oh, this song is, this song, I couldn't have written this song, or I wouldn't, this song doesn't share my experience. And so learning more about it that way, like, I mentioned my husband is Nigerian. So I like, listening to a lot more like Fela Kuti music, and like, what does that say about that time period? And, and like current Nigerian pop music, and what does that tell me about that culture? And so I've been much more, and I think always, listening is learning. I learn from music. I like to feel through music, but I want to learn from it even more.
Yeah.
And so, now I want to learn about things that I don't know about yet, and how people feel about things that are different than my experiences. And so that's been more where I've been heading these days.
What a great description, because you don't necessarily have to commit to a book or a documentary or an entire podcast. You just throw
Right.
on an album. That's awesome.
Mhm.
Well, Dr. Mayer, where can our listeners find you, your work, your research online if they wanted to reach out to you?
You can find me, let's see, Twitter, HMayerPDX. I mostly just retweet stuff that I'm mad or excited about. And my book is Beyond the Rebel Girl, which you can buy from Oregon State University Press or Powell's Books or anywhere else. And yeah, that's a good way to hear what I'm doing.
Well, thank you for talking with me. This has been an awesome conversation about punk, about history, about teaching. And yeah, I'm super thankful for you and your time.
Yes, thank you for having me. It was fun.
So that was my chat with Dr. Heather Mayer. Dr. Mayer, thank you so much for coming on the show. I was so pumped to be able to chat and to nerd out and to just hear what you have to say about your history with punk and with music and with history itself. And I felt like this kind of relaxing calm wash over me as we were chatting, and it just felt like such a fun conversation for me. Greg, what did you think?
Well, I really liked listening to your interview with Dr. Mayer because you were very excited. And as listeners of this show will know, I have cranked through so many guest interviews in the past several months. So it's just like awesome to have a full Keith interview where you just like went for it. So I hope everybody enjoyed that. But Dr. Mayer notes the repetition from decades apart. Like she was noticing trends from the 70s that are reoccurring now. But we know that we can live through something terrible and that we get reprieves from things that are terrible. I really liked that. And it gave me a nice long view of what historians actually do, because for historians who are documenting what's happening now, these things will take years and years to analyze. And then they come out at a much later date whenever we know what happens. We know what the consequences of things are. So consequences of the last several years will still reverberate across time for the next several years. And then that's the work of historians, to be documenting those consequences. So like journalists and current events people, like they are documenting and reacting in the moment.
Right.
The work of historians is completely opposite from that.
Yeah.
And I really, really liked that a whole lot. But the album Let's Talk More Rock is like so in your face. And I loved her and her friends talking about, political engagement, and it gave her something that she was seeking, something more in the world. And I really dug that. I also loved the story of finding a protest song, People's History of the World, and translating it into French for her school project. That was like the coolest story. And I love the idea of the French teacher who was like, where did you get this? And the teacher was like blown away and totally supported her efforts, even though it says fuckface in the first line. And, by the contents of the music, and like, this is hands down the coolest story, and just shows to me the powerful idea that older people can learn from young people as long as they're open to it. If a student comes into my classroom and says, hey, I got this band I think you would like I had a student last year who was recommending bands to me like every week. And I would go home and I would put his music on Spotify, and some of it I loved and some of it I didn't like, but I was like, thank you so much for trusting me with your suggestions. I was like stoked for this French teacher in Heather Mayer's classroom years and years ago that supported this. And I love that she dove into coming to understand the lyrical content of Propaganda in French as well. It made me think about how some of my favorite novels are not written in English, which is the only language that I read.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I'm very aware of the fact that when I read a Mikhail Bulgakov novel or a Haruki Murakami novel, I'm actually reading their translator's interpretation of the original Japanese or Russian. So like when I read a Murakami, I'm actually reading Jay Rubin, his one of his main translators. So the idea of accurately translating a Propaganda song is super awesome. And I almost want to hear Chris Hannah sing Dr. Mayer's French translation at a show. I think that would be so, so cool. She also talked about Good Riddance, Operation Phoenix, one of my favorite records. and the battle of conservatism and curriculum, like the culture wars of the 1980s, documented by the historian Gary Nash, about when like Phyllis Schlafly was like doing all kinds of curriculum wars and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Love that stuff. And I love how you two also talked about helping students process the emotional aspect of learning about the ugly parts of history. And this is something that utterly blew me away in my college classes, how I began to sort of despise the history of the
Right.
United States. Like
Right.
I became deeply cynical, totally turned off of even wanting to talk about anything positive going on in the world. And I sort of like slunk into this funk of cynicism, and I turned into a kind of guy that was like, well, what about, or, but actually,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I had no idea how to handle what I was learning for several years. And I bet I was not a heck of a lot of fun to be around. So I love that Dr. Mayer was talking about the emotional weight of how we handle learning about difficult histories. So wonderful conversation. Loved it. And you two did a great job. So Keith, I know you did a second conversation for this episode. So who do we have up next?
Our listeners will remember Dr. Christopher Deutsch from our Cop Just Out of Frame and Name and Address Withheld episodes. Chris reached out to us this time after a September press conference where Donald Trump said, as many of you testified today, the left-wing rioting and mayhem are the direct result of decades of left-wing indoctrination in our schools. It's gone on far too long. Our children are instructed from propaganda tracts like those of Howard Zinn that try to make students ashamed of their own history. So later on, after a bunch of rants about Marxism and critical race theory, he then said, under our great leadership, the National Endowment of the Humanities has awarded a grant to support the development of a pro-American curriculum that celebrates the truth about our nation's great history. And then he said, today, I am also pleased to announce that I will soon sign an executive order establishing a national commission to promote patriotic education. It will be called the 1776 Commission. As a historian, Chris had some thoughts and ideas that he wanted to share about Trump specifically calling out Howard Zinn's work as propaganda, while also creating a commission asking students to embrace a totally pro-American stance, which we all know what that means to Donald Trump. So please enjoy our conversation discussing Howard Zinn, Donald Trump, patriotic education, teaching, the work of historians, and a little bit about propagandies, the people's history of the world. Dr. Chris Deutsch, welcome back to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propagandy.
Pleasure to be back.
So, Chris, this conversation is a bit different than our last talk because this time you reached out to Greg and me following Donald Trump's White House Conference on American History and the proposed 1776 project. And I definitely sensed this feeling of urgency in your message to talk and to specifically talk about people's history of the United States. So this panel attacked everything from public education to critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and of course, Howard Zinn. Can you give an overview of like what you were thinking or feeling as you were following along and watching this?
Yeah. Professional historians last week were having a day that is going to be decently memorable for at least a while, since the President of the United States decided to throw his political weight during a really heady, really contentious re-election cycle behind attacking implicitly, for the most part, and definitely explicitly at parts, what the work of historians are, while at the same time fundamentally misunderstanding, misapprehending, and misrepresenting what historians do. So it's in the midst of a broader, almost year-long battle happening below the presidential level among in mostly conservative circles, but it's not relegated to there. There's the far left has gotten involved, and other people have as well, of attacking the New York Times 1619 project, and professional historians are then roped up into it for a variety of reasons, not the least of which being publicly online as a historian now invites people jumping in and trying to get you with the questions, trying to rope you into answers, trying to outmaneuver you by doing gotchas. And this is really, I think, a moment to talk and think about history. And it just so happens that Propagandhi, like I think so many of us were, who came of age in the 90s, when Zinn's ideas were felt as a radical challenge in many ways, I think, to what we thought we knew or what we thought we were being taught. And I think that your format is an excellent chance to have people at the intersection of this band's work, the broader currents that brought us to be fans, and who are professionally connected to the work being discussed here at the conference and then since then.
So, Chris, for our listeners who might not be aware of the 1619 project and the curriculum, the school curriculum that came along with that, there's also a podcast as well. Can you share some of the information on this the 1619 project, like what the purpose of it is and how it reframes discussions of U.S. history and why that's controversial?
Yeah, so last year, the journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones had published something she's been working on for a while, a historical challenge to the public notions about what the grounding of America is and what the central story to America is. And it was published through the New York Times. And it was a massive project consisting of several essays, with her providing a kind of master or introductory overarching essay that had different ways of challenging and exploring U.S. history by wondering what if we put the enslavement of African and African descendant individuals as the centerpiece of U.S. history. How do things look differently when we do that? And it immediately garnered immense backlash. And I'm going to try not to go too much talk about the backlash since we'll get that soon enough. But the project is a broader tool that Hannah-Jones and others used to publicly create a space to discuss these things.
So what are some of the good faith critiques? Like, so you mentioned that most of the criticism has come from conservatives, but you also said that some has come from the far left. What are maybe some of the good critiques of this from historians, but also if you want to touch on some of the bad faith ones as well?
Sure. So most of the grounding for this discussion is definitely before my period of expertise in the 1900s. So if it comes to discussing the elements of the work dealing with post World War II, that's certainly something I could originally contribute to. But when it comes to particularly around the American Revolution, which is where the professional criticism is at its most delineated and kind of public, the historians Leslie Harris and Karen Wolf have both recently, again, publicly dissected the large argument. And for historians, this is like a really tough position to be in. It's where we're kind of in an unenviable place because for Leslie Harris, even before the project was released, she was worried about the arguments made about the American Revolution and slavery, and she had hoped to influence what the essay was going to argue before the essay was released in order to align it more with what current historical analysis and practice had led the scholars of the field to think. And that did not happen. So she did publish, Harris published in Politico, a hopeful, what was, I think, a really reasonable attempt to try to provide some level-headed, kind of like a calming professorial, if you will, voice to point out that there were real flaws, but those flaws weren't that big a deal. And actually, that the flaws exist is not the problem at all. It's not a problem in any sense of the word. The problem is the people attacking it, critiquing it, are so interested in piling on and in crowding out the narrative or crowding out the space for discussion that there's no reasonable way to point to the criticisms, and then to open up the criticism as a chance to have an even more enriching discourse. Because I can certainly say that while I certainly have read in the field to some degree, reading Harris's response to the 1619 project has greatly benefited my own grappling with these larger issues. So those are two. And then another scholar who's recently done really good public facing work. And of course, for historians, if it takes less than a year, it's like it is immediate. Like, we do not have day or week long turnarounds. So this is something we're not professionally trained to do. The way journalists, for example, might get an assignment and have like a 4:00 p.m. turnaround for the next day's publication or whatever. But L.D. Burnett, who's an intellectual historian who actually specializes in the discussions of the teaching actual project that is the historical profession. She recently published in Slate a response to Trump's speech that wrapped in some broader approaches or some broader takes that are very helpful for kind of grounding a more really thoughtful approach to the subject.
Yeah, and one thing that I think is important that that she mentioned and maybe clarified for those who aren't as familiar with what academic historians do is like the debate over the 1619 project that was taking place as a result. It's not like this is like new. This sort of engagement and critique happens, but it seems like it became so politicized because it got wrapped up in what seems to be like this renewed culture war. So kind of related to that, I'm wondering if you think this moment is an extension of like the 1980s and how divisive those, like the culture wars and history and classrooms and everything then was. Is this different? Are these things connected? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, excellent. Definitely connected. The teaching of U.S. history is at its heart a political project that emerged in various forms and various ways out of concerns about who is an American. Can people who arrive at U.S. shores who don't speak a lick of English integrate themselves into a country where the primary language is English? And how, and this is happening as public education became a thing, how would a country teach its kids who come from all of this crazy, unpredictable backgrounds, because there is the United States was a huge destination for people migrating. How do you ensure that they can inculcate themselves into a country that they presumably don't have much connection to? And that is where history as a public profession, as a teaching profession, really comes from. That it happened that academic history was already emerging at the same time, and it wrapped up perfectly with this, so that the modern system by the early 1900s basically came into place, where college professors teach future teachers at what would have one point been normal schools, who then go on to filter what they know about the latest academic knowledge and teach their students that at the K through 12 level. And that has always been political, always been politicized, always had a nugget of politics, because after all, the people learning about the past have their own take on it, And then that take serves their own interests, their own concerns. And certainly when we're talking about the United States, the views of indigenous peoples and of African-American descent and slave descendant individuals hugely matters, because of course they were, they're descended from people who were there at the beginning, regardless of where the people they're descendant from were actually at in the actual history. And the meanings of the past are incredibly relevant to their lives. So from the get-go, teaching history was politicized, a political project. And we definitely are experiencing, I think, a wave not unsimilar to what was going on in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s and 1950s, the 1960s. I think basically every decade has a massive upheaval around the value of history, what we can learn from the past, and what we're teaching about the past. And unsurprisingly, as is always the case, whatever currently is going on is going to inform and influence what we're discussing. So certainly issues about police brutality, the fact that in the first real urban police forces come from the South, even before the North had actual police forces, and they are extensions of slave patrols in particularly cities like Charleston, South Carolina. So this is all, it's in some ways part of a larger trend, but in other ways a very relevant, recent, current battle.
Yeah, I think it was a chat on his book, War for the Soul of America. Andrew Hartman talks about history as a battlefield, and I can't help but, as a middle school teacher who continues to get angry phone calls and emails from parents, I'm even if it's a metaphor or not a very creative one, I kind of feel like I'm in the trenches. And, one thing I hear a lot is revisionist use as like a critique or an attack, saying that the 1619 project or some new interpretation or some new research or book being released is revisionist history, rather than, you use the term reframing, right? So like, do you think that all history is revisionist? Is it like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, essentially 1,000% yes. My own project is to revise how we understand the importance between citizens, corporations and businesses, the government, and food and meat, and then the meat animals connected to them or that produce them, that the body becomes the food for us. And that's my historical revision, is because I think that it's not well understood how those things were important going through World War II into the 1980s. And therefore I am essentially, and always have been, a revisionist history. And I will continue to revise history because it is a process, to paraphrase from the historian Eric Foner, really history is a process of an ongoing discovery about our own society, about our own world, using a particular set of tools and looking at documents and evidence as we can find it. And I think that that's true, that it's going to always be contentious. And I do welcome contentiousness because after all, disagreement allows people to kind of like take a step back and think about, are they wrong? I know I've been wrong in my historical assessments. In fact, one of the reasons why I'm currently working on lectures that I hope to record soon are that I'm rethinking something as well covered, yet still more to be understood, the progressive era, which there's always room to rethink something as well understood as the progressive era. And that's a big topic, let alone other topics that are even more heated or that we haven't fully gone over. And that's exactly what the 1619 project kind of brought into public sphere. Something that Harris and Wolf point out in a recent Political article is, in some ways inadvertently, the 1619 project highlights an aspect of history that's really important, and that is if a historical project, a book most typically, but an article or maybe a lecture or a talk gets it wrong, it's an invitation for someone Well, see, that's the point. That's something I need to back up. Get it wrong, of course, is a subjective point. If someone feels that you're wrong because they have evidence to support a stronger claim about something, then there's an invitation, an implied invitation to have a back and forth and to suss out what the meanings are, and in the process, hopefully come to a more robust understanding that will usually end up resulting in the conclusion being it's complicated, because that's basically the conclusion everyone, that's the conclusion to every historical project, every academic work is it's complicated.
Yeah, one of the articles you sent me this week refers to history as this moving stream, right? And everyone else seems to be jumping into it, but I think the public, whether that is, most journalists or politicians, or maybe just people with like a cursory interest in history, maybe we're kind of rooted more in emotional and ideological argument, and kind of being unaware of how that is, like you said, sussed out in the field. I think that kind of, at least for my interactions with people I know who don't necessarily read or engage with history a bunch, it kind of becomes more of a political talking point rather than what you said, like evidence-based critiques and like conversation. So I want to tie this in then with Howard Zinn. And I think Howard Zinn gets misrepresented in a number of ways, like as though like educators teach his work, like a people's history, as some standalone source. Like I'll admit, okay, 6 years ago, I was like, all right, guys, now we're going to read some real history, right? Like, so I kind of fell into that, but I borrowed a lot of ideas from Kevin Levin, who wrote a book recently called Searching for Black Confederates. If you're listening, you should totally read that. And he talked about using Zinn as a way to teach narrative, because his narrative's kind of so over the top. So I'm curious if you could speak a bit about why Zinn seems to be so uniquely controversial as a figure within, the field of history. And I kind of can't help but think, like, ironically, conservatives in a way reigniting this culture war seem to be unaware that academic historians are also highly critical of him. And it would be great if you could share some of those thoughts or critiques of Zinn's work and his framing of history.
Sure. Not historians don't really talk much about Zinn anymore. I think his moment has passed. When I've been in this game long enough that when I was working on my bachelor's degree, the person who would oversee my master's project once I got a master's program in the same school asked a show of hands for who's studying history because of Zinn. And this would have been, because I'm pretty old now, is it 18 years ago? No, it's not quite 18. 15 years ago, something like that. And I was basically like the only one because of everyone else had more traditional routes to history. And in that sense, historians don't really litigate Zinn anymore. That his influence on the profession had a lot to do with what I think is a really valuable tool that a good teacher and a good scholar does, and that's just spark interest. Because like the hardest thing about teaching history at my level, I'm not sure what your interaction is on this, but the classes I teach, the typical first day is, I know you guys hate history, but we're gonna do this, right? And it's not uncommon for me to get response from students saying that their high school history was unfortunate, but I've made history more interesting. And that's a power that Zinn had for a long time. And on top of that, and what reinforced my connection to Zinn was not only reading his book on my own, but the fact that punk rock labels would publish his work is something that was super interesting to me. So Anti-Flag had a blurb in one of their earlier records from him commenting on one of their songs. And it's not that Zinn knew anything about punk rock. He was an old man by the time punk first launched back in the late 70s. So he was already out of the age group that would have been interested in this kind of music, considering he was a World War II veteran after all. And that gave him like a new life cycle. But as far as professional historians go, the current general understanding is simplistic narrative. There isn't just a them and an us. There isn't just an elite and a non-elite, and the us, the non-elite, aren't this contiguous group that stretches over time. And the last historian I've seen actually engage with his work seriously was a book on Colorado mining, and particularly because of Zinn's importance in getting the Ludlow massacre into historical, into the professional, doing professional historical work on the Ludlow massacre. This book reframed the Ludlow massacre as part of a larger war in the coal fields of Colorado that was part of this broader labor war against mine-owning companies, where laborers would, take up their rifles, go sniping, and kill, mine owners, or try to at least. And so that's the last person I saw actually engage in Zinn. Now, when he came out, though, he was more or less dismissed for a few reasons. One, this was a popular history book published by Harper and Row, a popular imprint, so this was not swinging at academic audience. And the scholars who felt that Zinn was part of a group of historians called something like the Radical Historian Group, or the Radical Historians, or something like that, that really came, there was a group that came into prominence by the end of the 60s with the Vietnam War protests, with civil rights protests, and kind of had this reputation for being more concerned with radical politics than with critical historical analysis, whether that's fair or not. And this book just seemed to confirm that. So I'm just right now looking at the Washington Post published a review in 1980 from a scholar, from a historian, and it is this might be the best. This might be a best summary, a sentence that quotes the best summarizes the takedown in this Washington Post review. We do deserve a people's history, but not a simple-minded history. Too often of fools, knaves, and Robin Hoods. Too often of fools, excuse me. We need a judicious people's history because the people are entitled to have their history whole, not just those parts that will anger or embarrass them. And that might be a slightly more conservative, but a generally representative of the harsher reactions to people's histories, arguments. And historians, for the most part, don't really engage too much with Zinn beyond what I've already mentioned. And at this point, he's kind of more of a cultural artifact. And this is why I think that Trump's current project is so noteworthy. That's the only historian they could think of.
Right.
I mean, I've read history books written in the past like 20, 25, 30 years that said some things and made some analysis and presented, most of all, credible and compelling evidence that might have made for more shocking contributions to calling out scholars. But they're just so disconnected from what academic history is, the teaching of history at K-12 level, that the best they could conjure up was a man who died in 2010 instead of someone who's currently still alive and currently writing.
Yeah, the fact that I saw even like David Blight tweeting about this, it's like, you guys brought David Blight onto social media. This must be serious.
Yeah, we could even talk about Blight's most famous, I think it's his biggest book, I could be wrong, Race and Reunion, where he argues the point of statues, the point of Civil War commemoration by the 50th anniversary was to erase the fate of the freed African Americans and to use racism to bind the North and the South. Now, granted, the book's very big, and this is like trying to cut it down to the fewest possible, most eye-catching sentences. But I mean, if you want to talk about someone who you would think would be talked about in this era where they're talking about tearing down statues, you could at least attack David M. Blight's Race and Reunion, which is an incredibly rich historical analysis of the attempts by certain Northerners and certain Southerners to reconstruct a memory of the Civil War that it totally excluded race and slavery and racism, and in the process allowed for a government to emerge at the federal level and across the southern states and even the northern level in northern states that basically trod on African Americans instead of giving them full rights.
So, Chris, I read a response to the White House conference and the proposal for the 1776 commission from the political scientist Paul Musgrave. And he said something like, American ideological hegemony has long been a sort of bottom-up affair in which local celebrations of nationalism have given the concept of a nation meaning. Do you agree with that idea of like a bottom-up patriotism, and do you see this as like a moment that will switch and change, or do you think this is more just kind of an opportunity to capitalize on divisiveness? I mean, what do you think about that quote and that thought there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the phrase American ideological hegemony is doing a lot of work. A lot of work that I'm not 100% on board with, but certainly I think, and there are a lot of really good historical work that I think goes into this, but his point about bottom-up affairs with local celebrations is kind of the creation of an American republic where historians have in fact spent many decades looking at public displays of nationalism or patriotism or nationhood or various means in which the country's identity as a country was founded on having a singular or a public-facing thing to celebrate. And that I think makes a lot of sense. I think I could pick apart and be a bit uncomfortable with American ideological hegemony because that's just way too political sciencey for me. But yeah, there definitely have been a lot of the really important bottom-up affairs that create that give national meaning. I mean, the really like Memorial Day, for example, speaking of David M. Blake, came from celebrations by African Americans in the South over the end of the Civil War, that the first celebrations about liberty and freedom coming out of African American communities, both free before the Civil War and those who were able to join after the freedom. That I mean, talk about meaning and talk about bottom up. I mean, the most the most elite African Americans in the South were hardly elite, and so I think that there's a lot of truth to that sense. And then the question becomes, who gets to do, whose presentation of it gets adopted, or do people believe? And I think that's, a much more messy historical process that involves a lot of local back and forth, where even within the elite class of local elites, say, for example, the business leaders of Des Moines, Iowa or something, are battling over a parade and who gets to be included or not, that those are combative terrains or spaces to generate national meaning.
So do you think this is like, what do you think the long-term goal is? Do you think this is like they're really hoping for this? I mean, one, the executive, branch, the federal government has really no power, from the best I understand, to create a national curriculum like this. Is this just a way to further divide people? Is this a way to further kind of capitalize on certain buzzwords? Like how do you see this in terms of like previous fights over history in schools?
Yeah. This, I think, is in many ways, it's in many ways a kind of an extension. I mean, the fact that Stephen Miller is very likely behind a lot of this stuff, and Miller comes from having orbited around David Horowitz, who is a longtime conservative activist, former leftist, for really famously goes from left to right, original founder of the New Left, and participated in a lot of those battles over academic production regarding America's past, America's future, America's present, and the radicalism of the professorate. So in that way, it's definitely deeply connected. Mm-hmm. And certainly I think there's a kind of an unsurprising through line in all of these moments, especially the more recent ones since the Civil Rights Movement, increasingly seem to center African American position within the United States as this kind of like central question. And that's what the 1619 versus 1776 project deeply has implied with it, because of course 1619 proposes that you look at U.S. history and think about U.S. history from the eyes of someone who is either enslaved or whose ancestors were enslaved, and try to wonder about U.S. history from that perspective. And that's deeply challenging to someone who wants to say that the closest thing any human being has ever come to having a perfect government would be the United States government created in the 1780s out of the Constitution.
So I'm curious, Chris, are there any particular lines or lyrics from A People's History, the song by Propaganda, that you think really stand out right now that might echo this push for like a national patriotic history curriculum?
Yeah, and it's what's funny is in some ways what the 1776 project hopes to create is exactly what Chris was writing about all those years ago, is a history in which knowledge is fixed and you hyperfixate on a couple of elite actors who are privileged to have done everything, and people who can most connect with them are the most part of the in crowd in society, and that everyone else is relegated to the gallows or the prisons or the poorhouses, or working their lives basically into grounding their bodies into dust from hard labor. And his response is an understandable one, and that is to kind of engage in that radical history project that's been proposed, where one doesn't care who was president, really, because chances are the person is a thief, a liar, or a cheat, or is going to lead into a giant war that's going to kill lots of people for little benefit other than certain privileged or elite people or well-connected businessmen.
Chris, do you have any other thoughts about either this song, the 1619 project, like the conference, anything else that you want to share about history, about those things before we wrap up?
Yeah, the Propaganda song, A People's History of the World, I think is an excellent song, not necessarily because I particularly think it speaks to what has happened in education, because of course he's thinking, this was written decades ago and it's about his own project, his own experiences, which were longer ago. I mean, we're living in some ways in a world Howard Zinn created, rather than the one he was responding to back in the 70s or even before. And so it's not 100% clear what a modern take on this would be. Yet I think there's some real power in his challenge for us to think critically about what we receive, the information we have, and most important of all, a kind of optimistic hope that we can, in fact, learn more and use that to enhance our understanding of the past and the present, and not kind of fall prey to kind of reflexive cynicism. One that I think Howard Zinn showed all the way to the end. Interviews he gave all the way until his death, despite all his personal tragedies and all that, reflected a deep belief in the youth of today. Of the young people. I mean, I think it's notable that punk labels in the 90s and early 2000s were promoting his work, and that he let it happen, even though there's, it's really an unexpected marriage, but it speaks, I think, to that drive to cling to like hope, and a hope grounded in a realistic expectation of what can be done, and a belief that the people who have presented with the ability to educate themselves further and engage honestly with, their own world, democracy could break loose, as they put it.
Well, Chris, I got to say thank you. I keep reevaluating my own journey as a history teacher, someone who, didn't take AP classes in high school, someone who had, really great classes in college. But I mean, I feel like I'm only recently starting to understand history as a discipline, as a process, and the more I know, the more I realize, the less I know. So there's like this amazing, like, more confidence, but at the same time, I still can't help but feeling like, wow, I don't feel prepared, and I don't feel trained and competent to address these really heavy issues with 13 and 14-year-olds. But to be able to engage with historians on social media, to kind of see those conversations and discussions and arguments take place, I gotta say, it's been just as informative and in my process as a history teacher than going to college. So, like, you've been a part of that, and I say thank you for this conversation, for other conversations, and for all the work that you do.
Well, thanks. I mean, I appreciate hearing back as well, that hearing your thoughts, your ideas, being a unique perspective that you're both teaching at a much different environment than I get to. And as you grapple with all this stuff, new questions emerge, new perspectives emerge. I mean, I'm reminded of, I know this is a little off topic a little bit, but that student who unfortunately caught the eye are conservatives, who asked, what is math and what is algebra? And I mean, that's what we need, or else we come up with really bad history. We come up with really bad science. We come up with really bad mathematics if we're not willing to do that. And learning is a teaching process, and teaching is a learning process where, I learn by interacting. I, hadn't read the Washington Post the published take on Zinn before. And I mean, I knew some of the responses, but it's always fun to ground my knowledge a little more in some actual evidence. And yeah, I mean, I guess if anything I take from these kind of interactions is that Zinn was right. And there is reason to hope. It seems dark and it seems overwhelming, but ultimately, we are the product of people, and there's no reason to think that the things that they did and got themselves through, we can't equally do.
So that was my interview with Dr. Christopher Deutsch, the unofficial third member of the Unscripted Moments podcast. It was really great to have him reach out to us. And there was this urgency, right, that you could tell that he really wanted to be able to put these ideas out for others to hear, but to be able to contextualize the conflict and controversy and the debates over the 1619 Project, Howard Zinn, and how those things are being strawmanned by individuals like Trump and those in his cabinet.
Yeah, and I really liked this chat with Chris as well because so many people seem completely hell-bent on fundamentally misunderstanding the work of historians.
Hmm.
And the people who are so heavily critical of the work of historians do not even understand what historians even do every
Hmm.
single day. They don't understand about archival research. They don't understand about tying threads together. Like, it's a very, very specific job. And I love the notion that Chris talked about the lengthy and longitudinal approach to the work that historians actually do, about archival work and finding evidence for things. And it's not like they're just pulling things out of nowhere. So Chris's comments on that were really intriguing to me. And I also thought it was interesting how historians in the field, because Chris is a current working historian with a brand new book coming out from an academic press, which is, peer reviewed and going through that entire process. But historians in the field have largely moved on from Zinn, just demonstrating
Right. Right.
how Zinn is literally just a buzzword to people in the administration. They're just demonstrating how out of touch they are when they name drop a guy like Zinn, who died in 2010 and who retired in 1988. So to name drop Howard Zinn in a conversation in the year 2020, in the lead up to a presidential election, which one is completely planning to steal and undermine for months to come, which we've seen that occur, it just shows how completely out of touch these folks are, and how Zinn literally means nothing to them. It's just a name they probably found on Google based on, Stephen Miller's college years from several years back. And, it's also interesting to consider how punk rock latched onto the work of Zinn. And I guess it was just that time and place kind of thing. So to Chris, I love your conversation with Chris, and I'm so glad that he keeps coming on the show to bring a different angle on this for us.
The historian I mentioned, Kevin Levine, who wrote Searching for Black Confederates, which I highly recommend, he tweeted not long ago that the only time Zinn trends on social media is when conservatives bring him up. And to your point, Greg, I think there are far more controversial historians working within the field today that are just overlooked due to ignorance. I mean, we talked a bit about David Blight, his book, Race and Reunion, Eric Foner and his reworkings and revisionings of the Reconstruction era following the Civil War, or Heather Cox Richardson, who just wrote a book called How the South Won the Civil War. I mean, these are all reframings of historical narratives and events that we've kind of thought that we've set in stone, but they are having us collectively question, but they're still talking about Howard Zinn.
Yeah. Well, and I'm also reading Ibram X. Kendi's book Stamped right now as well.
Oh, yeah.
Fantastic. But like, it's ridiculous because the only thing that Trump accomplishes when he brings up Howard Zinn as some kind of dangerous threat to the country is that Howard Zinn sells a bunch of books on Amazon. Because picture living in a house where your parents or your grandparents have, Trump blaring through your TV on those horrible networks 24/7. And you hear, and say that kid doesn't like Donald Trump, but is living in secrecy as being against Trump's, rhetoric, because they're afraid of what their parents will do to them. And you hear the name Howard Zinn. All of a sudden, this kid's in their room on their iPhone ordering Howard Zinn off of Amazon. And, then the Howard Zinn book arrives. So the only thing Trump accomplishes by bringing up a historian who's been dead for 10 years is to, sell books that go into Howard Zinn's, trusts, So that's all they're accomplishing by name dropping the guy who's been dead for 10 years.
So, Greg, let's talk about the music before we get back into history and the lyrics.
All right, go ahead. Tell me what you think.
I've always held this idea that Less Talk maybe wasn't my favorite and I didn't absolutely love it, and I held it at a distance. Maybe because my main complaint about the record is that musically, the songs always felt a bit episodic to me. They're sort of like short vignettes, not necessarily fully realized compositions. I mean, Chris mentioned on his Patreon, I think it was Ryan Green who told him, you guys don't really like write songs, do you? And so I say that because A People's History is one of the best written and pieced together tracks on this album. And
I would agree with
I
that.
think at 2 minutes and 21 seconds, compared to everything else on Let's Talk, it kind of really feels long. But some of the other tracks make me feel like they were cut short. I wasn't really ready for them to be over, even if the band said everything that they wanted to, musically or lyrically. So A People's History and Refusing to Be a Man, so the bottom half of the B-side, feel just much more complete. And A People's History still isn't a typical chorus verse song, but it has elements of songwriting that show the band is growing and expanding. It's not just these parts, but it does have bridged sections. It has these shifting tempos, but nothing really feels choppy like some of their earlier work sometimes does for me.
I agree with that. And that's actually a really nice way of putting it. And so if you think about the start of this song right off the bat, I love the opening riff with the guitar effect. That slightly muted opening riff into the fast banger makes me convinced that this would be such a great album opener.
I agree.
And the content of this song, it's a big picture nature song about the people's history of the world. And it makes me feel like it has this macro view of overarching themes within the record. So say you start off with a song about the world, right? Giving an overview of the ways our education took shape and how we learned or didn't learn about the entire history of civilization. And then you move into the smaller views throughout the record on themes like fascism, animal rights, LGBTQIA plus rights, and more would have given this album a different flow for me. That said, the record is fantastic, and I have no issue really with the sequencing, but I still feel like this should be track one because it's about the world. It's about human civilization. So you go big, and then you funnel down into all the different subtopics that the rest of the album has. But I love that. And then it's just, and just comes right in, man. Just hits you right over the head.
My favorite guitar part after that, which is just so catchy. I mean, I've been humming that riff for the last 3 or 4 days, but the guitar part that really stands out to me coincides with "Who've Manufactured Our Delusion." So if you remember,
our delusion.
So if you remember when the Beeve talked about certain riffs on Woe Is Me, speaking as an aspiring guitarist, this style, like what's going on with the guitars there, that style of riff has always caught my ear. It has a really unique melodic sound that's layered with higher open notes. I'm pretty much always love when a band does it. I mean, I could think of specific examples of Death and Slayer, Propaganda, and Strike Anywhere, all bands that are really different, utilizing this sort of open note technique to create a lot of texture and melody. And I love that part of the song.
What do you think about the bass and the drums within this song?
I never really thought explicitly how much I love the bass on this album. I mean, the tone, how dialed up it is in the mix, at times makes the song feel even faster. And with the bass, I think the backing vocals fit better on A People's History than on some of the other early Propaganda songs where there are those shared layered vocals. And the drums, I thought back to what JP said about Jord and how the fills have to be different.
Yeah.
I don't know how he does it, but there are these really unique and intricate fills that stand out. But then he goes on these really long passages where he doesn't overplay. And the highlights that he expresses are really just in some cymbal work. But then he kind of jumps back, having these really cool snare fills, and then the song throws on the brakes with about 30 seconds left, and it really kind of drives those points home in the lyrics. It doesn't pick up again, and I love that. It actually just kind of teeters out and lets the music and the ideas breathe a bit. And that part with George playing at a slower tempo, there's the bass and the distortion humming and resonating. That, I think, is such a great foreshadowing to some of the more intricate and experimental drumming that Jord is going to display on Potemkin onward.
And I really like what you said about John's bass being super up high in the mix, because I have a huge thing for bands where the bass is almost like the lead stringed instrument in the music. So like I'm a huge No Means No fan. Rob is clearly the lead instrumentalist in that band. I'm a huge Descendants fan, where I know Carl and Tony have done amazing bass work over the years. I'm a huge Face to Face fan because Scott absolutely rips on bass, and Matt Riddle before him. But John Sampson on this record, to me, is almost like a lead instrumentalist, because the bass tone is so specific that you can hear it all the time. It's never buried. So I love that you pointed that out. And that part where they put on the brakes going into that bridge, it's like dun 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 dun. Bah, you can vote however the fuck you want. Oh my God, I love that part. It's the perfect about face in the song, and I appreciate it so much because I love the fill going into that, and then I love the way dun dun dun, just got those big ringing riffs on it. And you're right, because the vocals and the lyrics are so clear. Yes. And I love the way that you can hear every idea. The backing vocals on the entire last 30 seconds with, Jord and Chris sing it together live, but I think it's John as well singing backing vocals on this song on the record. But man, they just sound so great together in those last 30 seconds where it's really slow. I love it.
And then Greg, speaking of vocals, I think with Chris, there's more power and confidence that he's showing than he had up until this point in How to Clean Everything. That abrasive, snotty snarl is almost gone from his vocal delivery.
Yeah.
And it's like I can hear the Chris that I'm familiar with on later records. And of course, even the podcast, I can hear him singing here. Even if it sounds different, it still sounds familiar.
Yeah, and you know what's crazy? I found a video, really wild live performance of this song from 2003 as a 3-piece at the Congress Theater in Chicago, and you have to go and watch this song because I was surprised at how much Chris was over singing.
Oh, interesting.
In this one video that I found from 2003. And my bet is that he was having some monitor troubles and some issues hearing himself because he was over singing so hard. This song, it's got such a fantastically delicate melody, but it's a song that fits in the vein of Resisting Tyrannical Government for me, which has almost like this delicate melodic quality that doesn't need to be overdone. You mentioned Jord not overplaying. I don't think Chris oversings it on the record. I just think that there are tons of great live performances as well from this one from across the many years, including like 1996 videos with John. This is on the Live from Occupied Territory DVD. But there was this one performance where I found where Chris, it just sounded like he was really overdoing it big time on the Today's Empires tour. So that was really an interesting performance for me as well.
Yeah, Greg, I think overall this song has equal parts speed and melody. And unlike some of the later records, especially Today's Empires, things don't necessarily seem so dark and so hopeless and so permanently set in stone. That the melody, I think, creates a levity that is mostly absent on the band's later albums. So I think this song really stands out as a unique one.
Definitely. Do you want to talk about the lyrics a little bit?
Let's do it.
So let's start with the opening section. And I was looking at this today, thinking about ways to break it up, and I could not break up the opening passage in a way that made sense for me. This first section, which is one long thought, is at some turning point in history, some fuckface recognized that knowledge tends to democratize cultures and societies. So the only thing to do was mobilize and confine it to priests, clerics, and elites. The rest resigned to serve. Because if the rabble heard the truth, they'd organize against the power, privilege, and wealth hoarded by the few for no one else. And did it occur to you that it's exactly the same today?
Where do you draw the line in that passage, right?
And I was like, because it's one long thought. And like I could cut off and did it occur to you it's exactly the same today? But everything else is one long thought, but it's very nicely said. And the line is so absurdly concise and so perfectly stated as to boggle the mind. I believe I was reading some work by Tim Wise and also possibly Naomi Klein, maybe in Wise's White Like Me memoir and maybe in Klein's Shock Doctrine. I can't precisely remember. But the idea was that rich whites throughout American history have been successfully able to pit poor whites against poor blacks, which is among the greatest tragedies in the history of this country for equal rights, pay, the rights of workers, working conditions, the way that rich whites are able to say they're coming for what you have, and that the poor whites would believe that. And since all the rich people were white, the poor whites believed that they too could one day become rich, which is just so sad, because what really should have been happening is all of the poor, neglected, and taken for granted people should have been banding together against those few people in town who were hoarding everything and then exploiting everybody at the bottom. So to me, in this instance, the fuckface that Chris Hanna is referring to is super wealthy folks who manage to keep poorer folks from working together to reduce the insane power of the people hoarding vast pools of wealth. So when people at the bottom actually are given access to the notion that their lives can get better, it actually makes the people at the top's lives harder. And this happens in cultures around the world. Like, for example, in India, there's been the historical caste system, which breaks it down into kshatriyas, Brahmins, Dalits, untouchables, and then also the merchant class, which I'm forgetting the actual title of. But this is common around the world. But let's look at an example that everybody knows. Okay, let's look at Amazon. Jeff Bezos, as of summer 2020, was worth $188 billion. Power, privilege, and wealth hoarded by the few for no one else. And did it occur to you it's exactly the same today? So Jeff Bezos could issue a check for $25 to every human being on planet Earth. Bezos could remove almost 16% of all currency in circulation in the US if he liquidated his assets.
Wow.
Bezos could buy 700,000 houses in the US at a median price of $270,000.
Oh my gosh.
Canada is currently at risk of running a $180 billion deficit this year due to COVID. Bezos could cut Canada a check for the entire amount of their deficit and have $8 billion left over. So when Chris says it's exactly the same today, look at the way Bezos treats his employees and think of all the things he could do with his money to make the lives of incredibly overwhelming workforce that work for Amazon the best lives of anybody living in the country. He could make every Amazon employee's lives instantaneously better literally tomorrow. And does he do that? No, because they're resigned to serve, like it says in the song.
That evolution, Greg, in how we pit people against each other, that is preventing poor whites from banding with poor African Americans, freed or enslaved during or after the American Revolution to prevent some sort of uprising or mass societal change. This just shifts and evolves, but it still exists today. I mean, just think about how often you hear middle class and lower middle class families, people deride those who are on welfare, because the myth of the welfare queen has taken root so much that has shaped our culture in thinking that requiring any assistance in any way is to be looked down upon, that we have to humiliate those people. We also have to be able to say what they can and can't buy. I mean, I have family members who receive government benefits and programs that they're on, and they still say the same thing about others.
Mm-hmm. It's because their TV is telling them to.
Right, right.
It's really sad. Do you have any other thoughts in like the first part of that song related to that opening passage in the lyrics? My next thought that I have is about the schools line, which you and I will know a lot about.
Yeah, let's get into that.
So the next line that I had some thoughts about is, and so if our schools won't teach us, we'll have to teach ourselves to analyze and understand the systems of thought control. And this line mattered a lot to me as in the 90s when I heard it, because I wanted to be a teacher for a long time. And it mattered to me all the way through college. and it mattered to me as I became a teacher. But I also want to preface this section that when I talk about my teaching experience, that I don't think that teaching is like any kind of like super special career to be put on a pedestal or anything like that. Like, I've seen teachers do tons and tons of harm to kids,
Yeah.
and a lot of teachers shouldn't be teachers.
Yep.
So while I talk about teaching a lot in my discussions of lyrics, I'm not trying to like glorify teaching. I'm trying to speak as somebody who cares about justice, cares about health, cares about well-being and equality for humanity. So like, even though my examples are largely in an educational teaching instruction context, I'm not trying to like glorify any of my achievements or anything like that. Early in my career, I fortunately had the chance to learn from a great field experience internship when I was at university, where the teacher would highlight guest speakers like Dr. Paul Farmer from Partners in Health. He had Bono on a guest speaker, like a conference call. Laura Bush, the First Lady of the United States, was on one of this guy's conference calls. And he had examples from all across the political spectrum, ideological spectrums. And these students got to have these experiences with these very well-known people, many of whom they agreed with and disagreed with, and that varied by student who they were most excited about. He would have these guest speakers. They would study these amazing current events issues and talk about issues happening now in the world related to climate change, public health crises, advocacy and social justice actions, and much, much more. So I was like a fly on the wall. I was like in the corner of this dude's classroom watching all of this happen, like a year or 2 years away from graduating, and being like, whoa, you can teach like this? What in the world? And what was so funny is his name was Matt Cohn, and he teaches in North Carolina now. He would be the worst critic of his own teaching. So I would see something where I was like, dude, that was the most amazing thing I'd have ever seen. And he'd be like, that sucked. I made so many mistakes. Was hating on his own teaching. And that is a habit that I carry with myself to this day, where I'm like, oh, I could have done this. I could have done that. Oh my gosh, it would have been so much better. His teaching was utterly inspiring to me and helped me get like a framing in my mind that teaching could involve more than note-taking, giving tests, giving grades, pledging allegiance to the flag, giving detention, trying to be a coach so that I could get an extra stipend. Matt's work was so inspiring to me because he was the guy I wanted to be. He was like, and so if our schools won't teach us, Matt would have taken that line and done a lesson about it. And, he would have had the students dissect everything they've ever learned in schools. He's the kind of guy who would have played this song in the classroom and said, what do you think? Am I teaching you how to analyze and understand the systems of thought control? Am I teaching you? Are you learning? And he would make the students be like, yeah, and they would talk about it. And it was the most amazing environment. So that to me was like how I began my teaching career. But without him, I would have been a lecturing, note giving, talking head up in front of the room.
It's been a lot of trial and error from seeing what I like from other educators and borrowing and stealing those things, resources, but also practices, and also making sure I do the exact opposite of some of the worst teachers I've had or the worst teachers that I know, and kind of trying to compile a list of the things that I've had to figure out on my own, the skill set, the information, but also being able to gauge from students themselves in what they want to learn about and how they want to learn about it. Having students be involved in that process too. There's not enough done to engage a democratic system within the classroom as well. And this kind of really makes me think of the purpose and the point of Zinn's writing and his methodology and his scholarship. So sharing this bottom-up history that so often we've gotten information on presidents and those with power and wealth throughout history, and that's it. Challenging that. And when I use the adapted version of Zinn in my classroom, it's not to say that this is better, and it's not to say that should replace any other resource, but it should be read and studied and analyzed and critiqued in addition to those other things that are being read, studied, analyzed, and critiqued. And so this bottom-up history scholarship that attempts to explain the narratives and perspectives of ordinary people rather than just the elites, not just the leaders,
Right. That bottom up history that you just mentioned is something that for a long time in my world religions class that I've taught at the high school level, that's what I have really tried to do. The narratives of normal people that you can meet on the street. So, like,
Hmm.
I would have my students come with me to the local synagogues, the local masjid, which is another word for mosque, which people might know, the Hindu temple, where and like in class, we would have 25 plus guest speakers a year. And I would have the local Rinzai Zen priest come in. I would have the Orthodox rabbi come in. I would have the
Hmm.
Unitarian Universalist reverend come in, and like so many more. And I truly feel the work I did for those years was like among the most impactful I'll ever have. And this line in the song, combined with my exposure to Howard Zinn and my experience working with Matt, modeled to me some extra ways to expose students to varying worldviews of the bottom up method of history and
Yeah.
cultural studies, and engage with it rather than just hear about it, which is a tremendously powerful experience for me.
So I wanted to share something that Zinn wrote in the first chapter of The People's History. He said, "My viewpoint in telling the history of the United States is different, that we must not accept the memory of states as our own. Nations are not communities and never have been. The history of any country, presented as the history of a family, conceals fierce conflicts of interest, sometimes exploding, most often repressed, between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated in race and sex. And in such a world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it is the job of thinking people, as Albert Camus suggested, not to be on the side of the executioners." And I hate so much that, speaking of just my experiences, both as a student, but what I've perceived in my classroom and others, that history is often just taught as this cemented, fully agreed upon set of information where debate and controversy and counter narrative are just pushed off to the side. And there isn't this opportunity to really question and think critically and develop skills. And using Howard Zinn in the classroom is reduced to indoctrination, when if someone actually saw how I teach Zinn, they'll realize that I'm using it in a way to teach also narrative. I don't teach it in a way to say, here's the real history. We read it in addition to the other sources that we use in class. And we also try to say, what is his historical narrative? What is the perspective of history that he is packaging and he is framing, and the evidence that he's using? And frankly, because it's kind of easier to teach narrative by teaching someone that has a perspective that is so over the top as in, it's a little easier for eighth graders. So when they start to encounter sources that are perhaps a little bit more maybe reserved or slightly secretive in their purpose or their goal or their aim in sharing this information, they can maybe pick away at those things because they've already had practice elsewhere. I mean, I use Zen in my classroom. We just did this in the last few weeks, in which I asked the students, how revolutionary was the American Revolution, right? How much change actually came about? We had document analysis in which we looked at a variety of primary and secondary sources. We used the textbook. We also read a chapter from Howard Zinn's adapted version for middle school. In addition to that, we also read from the historian Gordon Wood, who wrote the book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. So Zinn, of course, goes on to say that it wasn't revolutionary. It doesn't overturn society because he interprets history through class struggle. Because the class system is not overturned, it's actually a conservative event, preserving the wealth and power of the colonial elites, people like Jefferson and Madison. It doesn't create enough change. It is the wealthy Virginia gentry who are in power before. 4 out of the first 5 presidents in U.S. history were slave-owning Virginians, and Native Americans and enslaved people or freed African Americans and women. These people's lives did not demonstrably change in the immediate impact of the American Revolution. So Gordon Wood, we read from him, who argues it was incredibly radical. It creates more change in a political and governmental sense that had ever existed up until that point. It shifts the economy, it shifts the politics, it undoes aristocracy, it speeds up the spread of republicanism, and allows more people to vote than had ever voted in history before that, because more people can own property. It gets rid of primogeniture, these ideas of equality and opportunity and social improvement begin to grow. So it's not a single revolutionary event, but it's a process for progress over time. So the best part, Greg, is that after reading Zinn, who's supposed to be controversial and who's supposed to be indoctrinating and brainwashing students, they don't even agree with him. Most students, when we compare the two and I ask them to write to defend an argument and who they agree with more, they actually side more with Gordon Wood when they've read him.
That's such a great classroom activity, though. You know?
It's fun. Yeah, it's fun. And what I never did that in school.
Yeah.
For me, it was memorizing dates, and
Yep.
it was having a vocab journal, and it was memorizing the study guide for each test. And I never really read in-depth primary documents until I was in college. And even then, I had to kind of teach myself after that how to read and evaluate and assess primary documents. So much of this I'm still figuring out along the way, because I'm not a trained historian, and I'm a person who's working with limited resources and limited curriculum, while expected to cover, essentially 400 years of history in just, a couple weeks.
You know, what's really funny is that I was a history student at the University of Missouri, where Chris Deutsch currently is a professor.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of my first history professors is in his department.
That's awesome.
And she told me on one of my papers, you have no idea how to evaluate, do you? And I was like, I have no idea what you're even talking about. Like she called me to her office hours because I was getting like a low C on a paper. And she said to me point blank, I was like 18, you have no idea how to evaluate anything, do you? I said, I have no idea what you just said. And I remember it like it was yesterday. And this professor really did me a huge favor, because I knew that I was not cut out for the coursework that she was asking me to do. And so I really had to push myself and learn how to read, learn how to write, suck it up and go to the writing center, get some real actual help, because I had no idea what she was talking about. But dude, this line, I've got an alternative interpretation of, so if our schools won't teach, so we'll have to teach ourselves to analyze and understand the systems of thought control in a super dangerous interpretation.
Okay.
So this sort of line means something entirely different to me also. I know what propaganda is going for. I have my views on the world, but I'm going to refrain from naming any names here, because I don't want to give off the impression that I'm endorsing anything. But everyone knows about the increased and rampant nature of conspiratorial thinking going on right now, whether it's Satan worshiping pedophile rings run by Democrats out of pizza restaurants, flat earthers, of which a big name in music just came out as, interestingly, stolen elections becoming the new birtherism. But clearly, we have an educational epidemic that is only going to get worse with the proliferation of like deep fakes and AI and things like that.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that when I have personally asked people spouting these things to me in actual conversation, I immediately get called a sheeple, even by people that are very closely related to me. Say one thing against the preponderance of their conspiratorial thinking and boom, sheeple. So this is systems of thought control lyric is now very much being reverse engineered in the opposite direction by the people in a tiny minority that are gaining steam, who are totally convinced that the normal quote unquote mainstream person, which is in and of itself almost like an epithet now, like an insult. Oh, you mainstream, blah, blah, blah. They're totally a non-thinking and non-critical sheep without the power of critical thought, because if we'd only follow the tangled web of internet memes, we'd see the quote-unquote truth and how much of a sheeple we are. You see it every day, like people being like, you just don't understand the evidence is all there right in front of you. So like this systems of thought control thing, it's being used against actually occurring real evidence to the contrary. You know what I mean? So like this is being totally spun a lot in a lot of different ways right now. And I just thought it was worth pointing that out.
Greg, that's such a good point, because I've had a number of students come back to my classroom to speak, to chat, to catch up, and they end up sharing the podcast they've been listening to, the YouTubers they've discovered, the books they've started to read. And while I would never say that person don't listen because it's that person, you hope individuals can read and evaluate and critique and assess those, but they've bought into the grift. They've bought into grifts already in which ideology comes first, and academic or intellectual accountability or responsibility are almost non-existent. And that's so alarming. And I don't know how to really address that in a way to not discourage and say, like some sort of genetic fallacy. Well, because it's this YouTube channel, you can't trust it. Like I don't necessarily want to endorse wholesale dismissal, but I also hear 8th graders and 9th graders bringing up like Charles Murray's The Bell Curve and race science. I'm like, what are you doing on YouTube? Where have you gotten this information? You don't have right now the means to critique and assess this, because this is incredibly complex stuff, and it's also indecipherable from ideology.
And the thing is that once you buy into it and you start saying it to yourself over and over and over, anytime somebody tells you, say you believe something very deeply, somebody tells you you are so wrong about that, what is the natural response? To only believe it even more, and believe that you are on to something here that everybody else isn't privy to because they're a sheeple. So it's really tough. And so like, I'm not saying that's what propaganda is saying at all.
No, but that's a great point.
And it's just that like, whenever you talk about your schools won't teach you this, man, they're under thought control experiments, man. You got to hear this guy and this channel and this person. And then before you know it, you're being interviewed on Rabbit Hole, the New York Times podcast about the 7-year process of deprogramming yourself from the internet rabbit hole that you went down. And then before you realize that you had been taken for a ride for years and years of your life that you'll never get back. And those stories are scary. There's another line in the song that I really like, and it's, and share it with each other, never saved by brass rings or the threat of penalty. Love that line. And it reminds me of this summer so much that we just had, and the protests and clearing peaceful protesters out of the plaza by the White House so the president could walk across the plaza and hold up a Bible at a church and then declare himself the president of law and order just before the election. It's like a dare. It's like, cross me, I dare you. Kiss the ring, peasants. And so even though you know you're about to get tear gassed, in the nation's capital, you keep doing it anyway. I like that line a whole lot.
That always reminds me of Chris Hedges. Every time I hear an interview with him, he always brings up about how he teaches in prisons in New Jersey, and he teaches and he uses Zen, contextualizing power, something clearly that inmates already know about, placing that at the center of history. And every time I hear that, I think it's just incredibly inspiring.
Do you have any thoughts on the closing line? You can vote however the fuck you want, but power still calls all the shots. And believe it or not, even if real democracy broke loose, power could or would just make the economy scream until we vote responsibly. Do you have any thoughts on that line? Because I sure as heck do.
Let's hear it. I want to hear what you have to say.
All right. So the U.S. just had an election which has not been conceded by the incumbent. But in May, the House of Representatives passed a new pandemic relief bill. And so we're recording this on December the 6th. And the other day, we had over 3,000 COVID-related deaths in the United States. So we essentially had a 9/11 in one day. And so in May, the House of Representatives passed a new pandemic relief bill, which was not taken to the floor of the U.S. Senate by Mitch McConnell, one of the worst people that has ever lived. And even as businesses and schools nationwide are reshuttering due to the pandemic, the Senate plans involve 1-month extensions and other piddly band-aids over gunshot wounds. And Mitch McConnell just won re-election. And there's a new article today out that I was just reading about the inaction in the Senate. And after the Georgia voter registration accomplishments of Stacey Abrams and the subsequent election result in Georgia, where the state flipped to a Democrat result, it just goes to show how powerful the disenfranchisement efforts are at suppressing results of truly free elections in a nation that allegedly values freedom. So we have this one person who is holding up relief for millions upon millions of American people and businesses that are going under, just completely suffering financially, on the verge of losing everything they ever have. And you have this one dude that's like punishing us, making the economy scream. And, the election didn't go his way. And I feel like it's like 300 million Americans are like being held hostage because of an unconceded election. I voted in this election, just like you did. And I also got some pushback on social media because I went to vote this year and I wore a propaganda shirt to my polling place. And I posted a picture and I was like, hey, I'm voting. And I had my supporting cast t-shirt on. And we're now more than a month after an election in which the person who lost has yet to concede and acknowledge the transition of power, all while thousands are dying across the country from COVID, or COVID on top of other pre-existing conditions. But this is not a normal election, and this is not your basic one corporate shill versus the other corporate shill. To me, this was about, do we actually believe in the peaceful transition of power from administration to administration? And it is still about that to me. It's a month later, and we still don't have a guaranteed peaceful transition of power committed to by the people in the White House. And yes, while the incoming administration is most definitely going to be profoundly disappointing in so many ways, they will be hearing from me regularly about all the ways they are disappointing me, just like my Democrat senators, representatives, and governor in New York hear from me weekly about all the ways they disappoint me. But a major difference between conservatives and progressives right now to me is that conservatives don't critique the horrendousness of their elected party officials, whereas I barely like anyone in power and will critique people who are allegedly ideologically aligned with me. I will critique them relentlessly. And I haven't heard my POTUS supporting people who are in my orbit critique him, other than to say things like, I get that people don't like him. But that's all they ever say. They don't say anything more critical than that. If I think about an incoming Democrat administration, like, I want high-speed rail nationwide. I want universal health care, universal vision care, universal dental care to everyone, where everybody gets the same care as senators. I want immense green jobs and climate change action. I want to end undeclared and endless foreign wars. I want fantastic policies for immigrant workers who want to come to this country and make our country a better place. I want wages to keep up with rates of inflation. I want people to actually be able to afford to get the post-secondary education that they actually want. I want my taxes to pay for people's cancer treatments, not oil subsidies or the grotesquely inflated Department of Defense budget. So yeah, I'm voting in a way that I know will likely not result in almost any of these things within my lifetime. Power still calls all the shots. Hopefully we can avoid the worst fate in 2024 when our complacency and our apathy kicks in again and we have to do this nightmare all over again in just a couple of freaking years. But it's really wild. This last line in this song really sets me off, I tell you.
Greg, I don't think I can add anything.
That's fine. I don't care.
I was snapping along the whole time.
God, it makes me crazy. And so, yeah, we're being held hostage right now, financially, economically, by the people in charge. The House of Representatives has sent COVID relief bills past them, sent them to the Senate for months and months now, 6 months. And now they're like talking about, oh, maybe we'll get around to it now. And I'm just like, you are evil. And so it just makes me absolutely nuts. But yeah, this last line, man, it matters to me. You can vote however, but it's like we're still in this like ongoing endless nightmare where you know that the next 4 years are going to yield virtually nothing in substance. It's going to be 4 years of complete obstruction and horribleness. And then the Republicans are going to be able to tout the fact that nothing was accomplished by the Democratic administration. And then in 2024, whenever people are complacent again, and from, you know, sitting around for 4 years buying stuff on our Amazon accounts and watching Netflix and The Mandalorian, you might see a victory in 2024 that sweeps back in everything that we've seen for the last 4 or 5 years. But great lyrics in this song. Did you find any good YouTube comments about this song?
Yeah, one said, I found the song because of the Zen reference, and I'm so excited to discover this band. So kind of the opposite, rather than Propaganda fans finding Howard Zinn.
That is marvelous. I found one that says, so much of what's been said by Propaganda decades ago rings true, maybe even more so now than ever before. Thanks for making music that has gravity, that stands for something, and rips. Love that one. And then another one said, a people's history of the world is so radical and true. Yeah, give us the truth. So for a lesson for this song led me directly to finding A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. It led me to finding Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. It led me to finding the book Overthrow by Stephen Kinzer. It led me to finding other fantastic works of history that complicate the notions found in the mainstream U.S. public high school classrooms of the 90s, before the 90s, after the 90s. You know, the teachable moment for this song is to continue to ask myself whose story isn't being heard here when I learn something new. So I challenge everybody out there to ask themselves that question next time they read a work of history or a work of current events. Whose story isn't being heard here? And another thing is that I think I may have to get the Audible version of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States and listen to it on my runs in the next coming months in the wintertime when I do a lot of running. So I may reread in air quotes, because I'm going to listen to it instead, People's History of the United States. So hopefully the audio narrator is skilled and interesting.
Greg, I think as Chris Deutsch shared, history is a discipline with a specific set of skills and research methods. And whether someone is at a university or a museum or on their phone, we have to try to engage with historic content critically. And given both of the interviews and the conservative trend of painting Zinn as a boogeyman, I think it's important to remember that historians have different interpretations of past events, what happened and why. Some interpretations are better than other historians' interpretations, but all are limited because life is just so complex. There's no way to sum things up with a single interpretation. And my job in the classroom is not to preserve history, but it's to challenge it. And if the main narrative right now is this unquestioning American exceptionalism, well, that's what I'm going to challenge.
Something else really interesting to me is that the administration, whenever they talked about, the 1776 commission or whatever, and they name dropped Howard Zinn, they're essentially ripping on a World War II veteran who fought against fascism in the White House. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. There's a lot there. But let's go ahead and rate this. I really like this song. The meaning has shifted for me in recent years, which just goes to show that messages can be co-opted in multiple directions to serve multiple agendas. But the song's a ripper, and I'm going to give it a 3. What about you?
This is a raging track. It's aged really well in both lyrics and music. And our project here, Greg, has helped me pick out little sprinklings of less talk on the band's later discography. So I really like the song. It's also a solid 3 for me.
Well, this is our conversation and our episode on A People's History of the World by Propaganda from Less Talk More Rock. If you want to find us, you can find us on Twitter at PropagandaPod. You can find us on Instagram at PropagandaPod. You can email us at propagandapod@gmail.com. Thank you so much again to the doctors Heather Mayer and Chris Deutsch. Chris, this is your third time on the show, so you've been on 10% of our episodes now, which is hilarious to me. But we will see you all next time for another great episode that we will have a lot of fun recording and bringing to you in the coming days. So thanks so much for listening, and see you next time.
What powers the calls of the shots? And believe it or not, even if democracy broke loose, they'll just make the economy scream. So we vote responsibly.
Dee-nee-nee-nee-nee-nee-nee-nee-nee-nee-nee-nee.